So our first chapter for Biology 171 is kind of an intro to the field of biology. The title of this chapter is The Study of Life. So here we go. Kind of the biggest picture that we can think about in terms of biology and studying life is the planet Earth. So far, all that we know in terms of living organisms exists here on our planet. And, it kind of, as we'll see later on in this chapter, ranges from the really tiny to the really large, and thinking about how living things interact on a large scale. So biology, I mentioned this idea of living organisms a couple of times so far. Biology is the study of living organisms and their interactions with one another and their environments. So again, going from potentially really tiny, really small, something we cannot even see without tools like a microscope, to something really vast, like thinking about kind of all life on the planet. Now, we mentioned that it's the science of biology. Science is defined as knowledge that covers general truths or the operation of laws, acquired and tested by the scientific method. So science, when we talk about it, is both a collection of knowledge, what we know about living things, in this case in biology, as well as the process by which we discover that knowledge. And that process, again, is called the scientific method. So again, here's just a picture to illustrate that living things can be really tiny, or again, we could put them together to get something quite large, something like an ecosystem. Now, I mentioned that this process of science, the scientific method, right, is what we use to find out about the natural world. And it is very useful for telling us things about the natural world, although, we do exclude explanations or ideas that are outside of that. Now, as a part of the scientific method in thinking about the world around us, there are actually two different kinds of reasoning, of logic, that go into science. The first one is what we call inductive reasoning. So, inductive reasoning is a form of thinking where you take some related observations. So you kind of say, here's something I know about this, and here's another thing I know about this, and here's another thing I know about this. And if I put all those things together, then I can come up with a general conclusion. So it's going from something specific, from specifics to general. That is what is called inductive reasoning. Something that you can think of maybe as the opposite, deductive reasoning, is a form of thinking where you start this time with the general and then you go to specifics. So, you might say, for example, if I know that, um, let's say, some of you liked cats and dogs, right? Um, you might say, for example, cats and dogs both have hair. And so, other kinds of animals that are related to cats or dogs probably also have hair, right? That would be a form of deductive reasoning. Now, both of these two, inductive and deductive, are used as a part of the process of the scientific method. Um, So inductive reasoning, which again means that you take specific things and you end up with a general conclusion. So here's an example of that. You say members of a species are not all the same. We have variation. We're going to talk about later in the semester what the source of that variation is. But there's variation within members of a species. And a second observation, individuals compete for resources. And then the third, species are generally adapted to their environment. You can put these things together and come up with a general conclusion, where you might say individuals who are most adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass their traits on to the next generation. So going from specifics, right, to general. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, you start with a general idea. So in this case, notice that this is copied from here to here, right? So you can actually build this deductive reasoning off of the inductive reasoning we have done. Individuals that are most adapted to their environment are most likely to survive and pass their traits on to the next generation, what we said here. We can use this now, a general idea, to predict results which are, more specific. So you could say in this example, if the average temperature in an ecosystem increases due to climate change, individuals that are better adapted to warmer temperatures will outcompete those that are not, right? So looking at a specific instance of how this general premise might work. So here's kind of, a bigger, or rather a more complete idea of everything involved in the scientific method. You first make an observation that leads you to a question that you might ask about the world around you. From there, you form what is called a hypothesis, which is a proposed explanation that answers that question. And this next one, depending on the source, is maybe kind of a part of the same step here. It naturally flows out of this one as well, or at least where you make a prediction that's based on your hypothesis. A next key step then is to do an experiment that tests your prediction or hypothesis. From the experiment, you analyze your results and you decide, does this support your hypothesis or not? Um, and that if it's not supported, then maybe you need to come up with another hypothesis, another proposed explanation. Either way, you can report your results in some way. For lab class, as those of you who are registered for that, you'll be doing that primarily through keeping your lab notebook and submitting the pages of that. Scientists, who do this process professionally, will actually write up the results from many experiments most of the time into a kind of cohesive paper that says something new, that is then published in what is called a journal for other scientists to read. Another aspect of science is that we can have what is called basic versus applied science. So basic science, or also known as pure science, seeks to expand our knowledge regardless of the short-term application. So, this would be asking kind of questions of like why, or maybe how, like why or how does something work? Just to kind of explain things, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a direct application, something that will, shortly change the way we do things, right? Applied science, on the other hand, is about solving an immediate problem. Now, some examples of this would be when, medical scientists say test out a treatment for a disease, right? That would be an example of applied science. So something like testing a treatment or a product, those would be examples of applied science. All right. If not, let me ask you, for your opinion here, based on what we just said about basic versus applied science, what do you guys think about these items? Would these kinds of scientific studies fall in the category of basic or applied? So how about this first one, determining how a virus causes symptoms of disease? Is that basic or applied? Got some votes for both in the chat, but it kind of does look like most of you said basic, which would be correct, right? So remember, basic is asking questions of how or why. So determining how a virus causes symptoms of a disease. Again, and applied would be if we're testing something that is directly going to change things soon. So, knowing how the virus works might not necessarily lead to something that we can actually do to fight the virus, although maybe it might give us an idea of some kind of medication that we could give. And if we were testing that, then that would be applied. How about the second one, testing a vaccine to prevent a viral disease? All right, lots of votes here I see in the chat for applied, and that one would definitely be applied. By the way, we saw, I think, if you've been watching the news with the pandemic situation, an example of this, right, with the creation and testing of the new vaccines that are coming out, right? Definitely a kind of applied science. The science that they did there is directly changing things in our society right now. Um, how about this next one? Getting away from disease here, categorizing the types of protists. That's a kind of microscopic organism. Categorizing the types of protists in ecosystems before and after pollution. Okay, so I see a lot of votes for basic here. And that would be correct, right? Again, this is just asking like, how does this pollution change this ecosystem? But it doesn't necessarily, lead to something that people are going to do in response to that, right? Um, so it doesn't, directly change things in the short term. So it's basic. How about this last one? Genetically engineering a type of bacteria that can clean up a pollutant from the environment. Okay, I think you guys got the hang of that one. That one would be applied, right? In this case, we are creating something, this type of bacteria that can do something to change things shortly, after we study it here, cleaning up pollution from the environment. So I mentioned, right, that last step of the scientific method is getting your results out, publishing your results for others to see. And there is, one aspect of that is kind of interesting, which is that you don't just kind of send your report out there for everybody to see immediately. Most science goes through a process that is called peer review. So what happens in peer review, as I mentioned, scientists take the results of their experiments, they write it up into a paper where they say, hey, we had this hypothesis, we did all of these things to test it, and now we think that this is true. And they send it to a journal, which is like a kind of magazine that scientists read. But the journals don't just publish everything that they receive. They do this process called peer review, where they'll take that article and they will send it to other scientists, other experts in the field, and and they will review that paper and say, well, this is promising, but I don't think. Are you sure that you said this is your hypothesis? But maybe there's this other hypothesis that you didn't think about. Maybe you need to go back and do some more tests to see. And so, the reviewers then kind of make sure that what gets published is sound, that the scientists have kind of thought of everything that they need to do in order to show that their hypothesis is true. And so, that in that way, it's kind of like a safeguard to make sure that everything that we consider in the field as our knowledge as a part of this science is thoroughly tested, right? Now, the parts of a paper that are typically found in these journals include the abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and literature cited. So I will save discussion of what all of these are for your lab class. So there is, in the lab manual, some information on how to write a scientific paper, and you will do some practice with that throughout the semester there. Oh, sorry. All right, so with that, I did want to give you guys a bit of a chance to do something with what we've talked about so far, as well as to give you a chance to kind of mingle with yourselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually break you guys into discussion rooms, breakout rooms here. And if you remember what living organism you said is your favorite, you're going to use that as the basis for this discussion. So the first question you want to ask, and I'm going to go ahead and I will post these questions to the chat so that you can hopefully have them as you discuss. But what is something that your two organisms have in common? And what happens if you say, hey, this thing that they have in common is actually true of all living things? Do you get a true or accurate statement? And then, is this an example of deductive or inductive reasoning? Secondly, pick one of the two organisms. What is a question that a biologist might ask about your organism? Formulate and write out a testable hypothesis or prediction. Would this question be considered basic or applied science? And then, sorry, that should say for number two. My mistake there. Using the other organism, the one that you didn't use for number two, how do you know that it's a living organism? How do you know that it's alive? Okay. So does everyone, like I said, I'll go ahead and I'll post those questions here to the chat. Let me go ahead and make some breakout rooms. All right, I think everybody made it back here. So let's just go ahead and briefly, I did kind of pop in and out. Some of you, I think I missed, you had already finished discussing by the time I came to your room. But, hopefully everyone kind of got the ideas here. So for question number one, what is something that your two organisms have in common? So, as an example for this one, let's pick, let's say, dog and cat, right? What's something that dogs and cats have in common? Let's say you said dogs and cats both eat food. So what happens if you extrapolate that idea to all living organisms? If you say all living organisms eat food, is that a true or accurate statement? It would not be, right? I mean, I guess depending on the way you define food exactly, plants don't exactly eat food, right? Um, Now, what you just did to take two specific things and put them together to make a general idea, that is inductive reasoning, right? And so part of the reason I wanted you guys to do this exercise is to show you that it is actually possible to get a false statement using inductive reasoning. Sometimes you can overgeneralize, right? And that's where the importance of the deductive part comes in. You need to make sure that you do test those kind of general ideas that you come up with to make sure that they are accurate, right? Now, for number two, pick one of the two organisms. What's a question? So I'm just going to throw out a good one that I heard from the groups. Let's say your hypothesis might be dolphins use echolocation to find their way around. So how might you test that? Well, perhaps you might put them into an enclosure and use a sound detection machine to see if they're emitting any kind of noise that might be echolocation. And then that would support the hypothesis. Although at that point, you wouldn't really know for sure that noise was echolocation. You might have to do something like, I don't know, say turn out the lights so they couldn't see and see if they could find their way to like a little treat you gave them or something. And then you'd be kind of more convinced that that is true, right? That particular question would be basic because again, just whether or not they are capable of this kind of behavior doesn't directly lead to some kind of application. I mean, I guess if you were testing whether or not they can use their echolocation to rescue somebody from, a shipwreck or something, that might be applied science. So for question three, then, using the other organism, how do you know that it's a living organism? Why is it alive? And so for this one, rather than give you an example or answer, we are going to go through some of the properties of life. Now, as I discussed with some of you in the breakout rooms, some of these things may be, if you look at it a certain way, non-living things might do these things as well. But if you kind of take them all together, if there's an object, a thing that does all of these things, then you can be pretty sure that it is alive. So the first aspect, the first way that we know that something might be living is if it has order. So a toad here represents a highly organized structure. It's got specific parts that do specific things. That's kind of what we mean by order. And further, within this type, this species of toad, we would expect that if we dissect it and cut it open, and then we cut open another toad, we would kind of see the same parts in the same general places, right? So living things kind of have this set order to them. And, in particular, they are made of cells. All living things are made of at least one cell. That's kind of a key unit of order in living things. Another thing is response to stimuli. So, one basic example of this, if you poke it and it moves, that is a response, right? This kind of plant here actually closes up its leaves if you touch it. And we can actually find these here in Hawaii. It grows as a weed in a lot of places. My 4-year-old daughter likes to go around and poke them and make the sleeping grass go to sleep. But that's a response, right? The living organism does something in response to its environment. And it could be fast like this, or it could be on a slower time scale, like a plant that's growing toward a light source. That's still a response to something in the environment. And then there's this YouTube video about sunflowers and how they move. In the interest of time, we're not going to watch the video here, but I encourage you to do that later. Um, Now, in terms of the levels of organization, with looking at order, we can actually break things down into smaller parts. And again, I said that biology kind of runs on a spectrum from really small to really large, right? And so this is kind of what we call the levels of organization, how we can build things up into bigger parts, or going this way, break things down into smaller parts. Um, so, we're going to actually start with the next chapter at the level of chemistry, looking at atoms and molecules and how we can put those together to make bigger things. Now, again, a key level of organization here is cells. This is the fundamental unit of living organisms. Anything smaller than this in and of itself is not really considered to be alive, but, anything bigger is. So again, organelles are pieces of cells, and then cells, we can put them together to make tissues. Tissues we put together to make organs. Organs we put together to make individual organisms. And then we put those together to make the bigger scale things like ecosystems or the biosphere. Now, one thing about these levels of organization is that you sometimes see what are called emergent properties as you get bigger. Um, where there's this new property that is something that's unique to that bigger level. A way to think about this, right, is that it fits this statement: the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So for example, a whole organism interacts with its environment differently than any of its organs or cells would. Something like a response, like we mentioned, where a plant grows toward the light. An individual plant cell wouldn't be able to do that. It's only by the cells all within that organism all working together that this is possible, right? And, again, we're going to look at chemistry. A chemical compound, a molecule, has different properties than the individual elements that make it up. So that would be another example of an emergent property. Last thing we're going to discuss here, looking at the diversity of life. So we can actually place everything, all living organisms, on what is called a phylogenetic tree. It's like a family tree. Now, I threw in this example here with Pokemon, just to emphasize some things about these trees. So again, this is like a family tree where we've got branching, and each time it branches in the biological tree here, it represents separation of two different groups into two different groups on the branches here. Um, these points where there's separation is what is called a node. And what it really refers to is the common ancestor of these two things. Now, if you go, just a little bit back and you hit a node where these two things split, then you know that that number 7 and 8 here, for example, are pretty closely related, because we didn't have to go too far back to hit this node to show the common ancestor. However, let's take, number, let's say take number 8 and number 3 here. In order to find out where they first branched and split apart from each other, we have to go all the way back here to C. This means 3 and 8 are more distantly related. They're not as closely related because we had to go pretty far back to find the common ancestor. Um, so, one other question, and I don't think we're going to have time to send you back to do your discussion groups for this. But one thing to think about, if you remember the two organisms you discussed with you and your partner, what do you think is the most recent common ancestor of those two organisms? So, for some of you that say had like cats and dogs, those two things are pretty closely related. They're both kinds of mammals. So perhaps you don't have to go too far back for their common ancestor. But if you had something like flowers and dogs, maybe the common ancestor was pretty distant, pretty long ago. Again, one thing that went into this idea of the tree that we see here is that even though you might have two very different things like dogs and flowers, there are some similarities, some things that all living things have in common, including the fact that DNA is the universal genetic language between all these organisms. And, at towards the end of the semester, we're going to kind of talk about this idea of diversity through evolution and some more evidence for that. Um, so I'm going to kind of skip over this, but just as a preview, there's a bit of information on Darwin and some of those ideas with natural selection and evolution. To end here, I'm going to talk about some of the main groups. Again, the big branches of that tree of life. We have three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So bacteria and archaea both are single-celled, fairly simple microorganisms. Um, our eukarya includes a lot of the more of the multicellular, although some of the members are still single-celled, like the protists here. But it includes things like animals, plants, and fungi. Again, as well as this group that is called the protists. There are actually multiple kingdoms of the protists here. But that have these all have a more complex cell structure than these, which is why they form a separate domain.